Welcome to Unit 4. This is going to be a week where we talk about experimentation, wild risks, doing things that only work because we're in the form of flash fiction, which is kind of fun and exciting. And some of the ideas that we're going to talk about this week really build on the ideas we began talking about in Unit 3 when we were talking about found forms. So if you haven't done Unit 3, it may be useful for you to do that unit first and then to come here. Because one of the concepts we talked about when we were talking about found forms is the idea that using a found form to tell a story works in flash fiction almost entirely because it's flash fiction, because it's small, because there's a boundary. If you wanted to take one of these found forms and attempt to extend it for 20,000 words, it just may become too much. And the same thing goes with the experimentations. So part of the reason that these experimentations work for flash fiction is because flash fiction is short and contained. And so a reader will allow you to play with them because there's a clear ending in sight. Let's talk a little bit about constraints. And I talked about this earlier in the workshop, this idea of embracing constraints. So let me talk about my own process for a second, because I like to think that my process may be similar to many of yours. I came to flash fiction as a novelist. I spent many years writing novels and really thinking about expanding my words, talking more about that thing, giving more details. And so when I came to flash fiction, it was difficult for me to really embrace that constraint. I was fighting with it. I was cheating. There's a lot of ways that we can cheat. I like to say that I was a flash fraud for a while, and I think that we all kind of start out that way. So a couple of the ways that I would cheat is I would take a long story, a story that was more than 1,000 words, and just nitpick this thing to death until it got under 1,000 and was probably still in the 900 range. Now it counted as flash fiction, but really what I had done is taken an autopsy to the thing, and it was felt moth-eaten, right? The other thing that I would do as a novelist is I would go into my longer works and I would take an excerpt of a longer piece and put a new name on it and call it flash fiction. Well, neither of those things are conceiving of flash fiction as flash fiction, but the second one, the excerpting, is a little bit more like the zoom lens. So maybe it wasn't written with the zoom lens in mind, but it's again attempting to go into a longer piece and carve out the flash piece within. So that one's maybe less of a cheat and more of a transition. So when you start to transition to flash fiction, really transition, when you really start to flip that flash fiction switch and start to see the world through flash fiction lenses, you stop fighting with that constraint. You really stop pushing against it so hard in terms of it being a problem, and instead start to see it as something to push against. So when we start to look at the constraint as a natural boundary that will contain our work, and that this is a good thing and not a bad thing, then we start to create flash fiction that were meant to be flash fiction from the beginning. You can think of this as the boundary of a canvas, let's say. If your canvas is this big, then you are going to create a work of art that's this big, right? And if your canvas is this big, you're going to create a work of art that's going to fit there too. And having a canvas that's this big versus having a canvas that's this big will necessitate a different sort of picture, a different sort of art. So I'm hoping by Unit 4 that you're starting to really see that this boundary of flash fiction actually is potentially pushing you to create a different kind of story than you may have created if you had a limitless canvas and you could go for 10 miles in any direction. That's good too. But flash fiction and that built-in constraint will actually force you to write different stories, different kinds of stories. So that said, this week, I'm really going to encourage you to go a little wild. And so some of the examples I've given this week have narratives that go backwards, that are told in second person, the whole thing, that are told in really short sentences, that are told in really long sentences. You can think of this being a continuation of the found form, but getting even a little bit more brave on what you may or may not try for a flash fiction piece, again, because there is a container. That said, once you start to experiment and once you start to play and once you start to try something maybe that you hadn't done before, eventually I do want you to ask yourself about the way that the form that you have picked, the experimental form narrative potentially, how does it enhance the content of your story? So we always want to talk about the form mirroring or enhancing the content. So you don't just want to randomly tell a story in an experimental way because it looks cool, but that ultimately a piece that really resonates with experimentation is one in which the experimental style of storytelling that you choose actually enhances and reinforces some of the concepts that are in the story. I think we can see this well in poetry. I think poetry does this really well, this idea of the form mirroring the content. For instance, a story, a poem, and I'll put a link to it here below, a poem about broken glass, looking at broken glass, may have the words themselves broken up on the page. The line breaks may enhance visually this idea of broken glass. And you'll see that some of the stories that I've provided, for instance, the story by David Foster Wallace, who has a very few sentences, but they're very, 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 very long, mirrors the high tension and high trauma of the moment that he is describing. So when we're in a moment of high trauma, there are no pauses, there are no breaks, it just keeps going and going and going. And so his choice of narrative storytelling in this case mirrors the story that he is telling. That makes sense. So I want you to think about not just experimenting, but thinking about how does your experiment actually enhance the story that you're telling. And just go wild this week and see what happens. And I am looking forward to hearing all about it.